So we have a guest joining us. I mentioned when we started the show, Rich Higgins. He's joined us several times. In fact, I realized it was not too long ago. He also joined us, I think a couple months ago. He is currently vice president of the Unconstrained Analytics. He spent 20 years combating terrorism. He's an expert on the nexus between theological doctrines and information age unconventional warfare. He served on the National Security Council in the Trump administration as the director for strategic planning. He was vice president of intelligence and national security for Red.LLC from 2011 to 2013. He's managed a classified project for Special Operations Command, SOCOM, 2010 to 2011, served as chair of Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict at the National Defense University. I want to give a more detailed introduction of Rich Higgins because the intelligence, the breadth of experience, the knowledge of how our federal government works, the knowledge of how the security operations of our country work, this is a person who can speak well to those issues. And I want to talk with him today about where we are in the 2020 election cycle, where we are with, as you understand, there has been no result, there has been no conclusion of the 2020 presidential election. A lot of people trying to announce who they anoint, as President Trump earlier said, anoint who they want to have won. But there has not been a victor, but we are in the middle of a battle in this country over the challenges to election fraud and who or what is going to present those challenges, whether the people who sit in positions of responsibility will respond to those challenges, and whether we as the American people can insist on our right to get to the fair and accurate result of who won the 2020 election. So without further ado, Rich Higgins, hello, sir.
Hey, Debbie, thanks for having me back.
Love having you on. And you know what? I will tell you, I told you ahead of time, I sent some questions. I will mention to our listeners the reason that Rich was on a couple months ago is his new book. I want to show you, well, you have it right here, The Memo. And this can be ordered from Amazon. I believe also ordered from Rich Higgins, but it's called The Memo. And the subtitle is 20 Years Inside the Deep State, Fighting for America First. I have to tell you, it's a great read. You want to read this book, an extremely easy to read, written at a level that people who are not heavily immersed in national security can follow, but a really important book in America for people to understand the way our country operates and what Rich Higgins revealed in his famous memo, which we're not going to talk about yet. So, Rich, I want to tell you, you've been starting out talking about the idea that the mainstream media's opposition, and it's massive opposition, of course, to the Trump campaign's efforts and Sidney Powell's efforts to get to the bottom of the election fraud in 2020, that all the media's opposition to the mission to get to the truth is actually, it poses a national security risk in and of itself. Can you explain why you say that?
Yeah, look, I mean, President Trump coined the phrase a few years back. He began calling the mainstream media fake news. Fake news is a nice kind of catchy bumper sticker slogan. What he's really talking about is propaganda, and it's propaganda being pushed down at the American public, and it really does two things. It first off, it excludes the truth, right? And then second, it replaces the truth with whatever fiction they try and foist upon you. For example, President-elect Joe Biden. And they've been doing this now for 3 or 4 years, although I think their role in what is most certainly a real ongoing coup by the Biden-enabled DNC China corporatists. It's now the media has become a national security issue, a real national security issue, not just a political one.
Okay, actually, I was taking notes while you were talking. You used the expression of China DNC corporatists. Can you say what that means?
Sure. I think where people look at let's look at the people that Joe Biden is naming to replace, to come in as part of his administration. Let's pick Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor. Jake Sullivan has deep ties to the international communists, going back to his time with Strobe Talbot, working at the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale. He did time as the Director of Policy Planning on Hillary Clinton's staff as these progressive groups used Islamist groups across the Middle East to set back U.S. policy positions. And, we see him, his legacy, this is Jake Sullivan, his legacy is one of Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and so where I'm going with this is there's a project underway internationally called One Belt, One Road, and it is nothing less than the unification of the Eurasian landmass as a new market. And the Chinese are pushing really three strategies. There's China 2025, China 2049, and the One Belt, One Road initiative. And these are driving so much of what we see because the international financing supports a Biden presidency. And so that percolates down into the system where you have mainstream media influenced by corporate money, advertising money, and so on and so forth, not only ownership, is now pushing this narrative that supports this wider geopolitical project. And so if you look at what's happening here simply as a domestic security issue, you're going to miss it. It's tied to this much larger geopolitical issue. And the pivot point for it is where the DNC meets and merges with these corporate interests. And so, the DNC has been eerily quiet given their role in all this. I mean, the question I find myself asking often, clearly it was an operation on the night of November 3rd rolling into November 4th and 5th. Who actually made the call to stop the counting of these votes in 6 states simultaneously? And, that actually happened. If one state stopped, Georgia, for example, we see that they faked the pipe leak in order to do that, and then they stuffed the ballot boxes. If one state did it, you kind of say, okay, there was some corruption there. When 6 states do it at once, you're getting into the realm of conspiracy. And I think that, what we have to ask ourselves is, are we comfortable with corporations and international money aligned with Chinese economic expansion across Eurasia dictating to the people of the United States who their president will be?
Wow, I am so glad you're able to explain all that and to lay it out. So it's alarming, and yet for many people, it's information they don't know, and it adds a whole layer to our opposition to what the left is trying to do. It's not just the Democrats trying to win one more election and trying to have a D in the White House and 7R in the White House. It's tied to these global, your term was global corporatists. It's tied to this whole China, DNC, larger mission of China, the One Belt, One Road, all of that, which is supported by, enabled by, encouraged by the left in America. I mean, so that kind of segues well into my next question. If I misstate anything you say, please say not exactly, or feel free to correct me. But I want to, before we get into this larger question of the concern America should have about a Biden presidency, I wonder if you want to add any commentary about why it is that in this country, as you heard President Trump speaking in the first 5. We've been talking on this show about the tremendous efforts being made by Trump's attorneys, especially Rudy Giuliani and Jenna, I forget her last name, and also Sidney Powell. I mean, great efforts to expose fraud, to explain how it happened, to explain what happened with the algorithms, and just the wide breadth and scope of interference with our elections. But the entire Republican establishment in Washington, entire Republican establishment, is simply silent. Hardly anyone speaking up on behalf of President Trump. Number one, why is that, do you think? And number two, how harmful is that to our country?
Well, honestly, I think it's extremely harmful for myriad reasons. I think that the reason that you're not seeing them do anything is, candidly, they're happy to see him go. If you go back to the memo that I wrote warning the president in 2017 about their efforts underway at the FBI to remove him using our surveillance capabilities and these intelligence and offensive counterintelligence programs, they have, for the most part, been passively participating in, Spygate, Russiagate. This is the Republican establishment. They passively participated in Mueller probe. They all knew in middle of 2017 that there was nothing there due to the classified testimony at the House Intel Committee. Yet no Republican broke ranks to tell the public that, and allowed the special counsel's office to persist for another almost 24 months. And I think It's just money for the most part, right? I think part of it's ideological. That they don't necessarily see Donald Trump as a traditional conservative, right? And he's not. I mean, he did a great job, I think, in his interview with Leslie Stahl before the election on November 3rd. They asked him in that 60 Minutes interview. Well, she asked him, who are your supporters? And I thought his answer was beautiful. He said, "Look, Leslie, my supporters are just people who love America." And, so his loyalty isn't first to party. It isn't to corporations. It isn't necessarily to the things that, a traditional GOP establishment politician supports. And, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past off the air. There's always been this question in the back of my mind as somebody who does security and influence operations, intel operations stuff. That when the KGB and the NKVD and the Chinese communists come after U.S. people, they aren't really interested in recruiting Nancy Pelosi or Adam Schiff. They already know they're ideologically aligned. They're far more interested in bringing in Republicans, not necessarily to make the Republican buy into the Communist Party line and turn them into a Leninist, but just to have them not speak up when the time comes and they're needed to.
Yes, we have spoken about that, and that is an extremely important point. The Republican establishment, and I've characterized President Trump's success in very basic terms. He made, he didn't run as a traditional Republican. He was a Democrat for a lot of his adult life, but he really re-engaged with the American people with the concept of loving America, loving the ideas of America, thinking America is noble, has virtue, should be protected, should be free, should have a return to free market principles, should return to a bustling economy. He just reinvigorated the love of America in the minds of millions of Americans. And because he did that, what you have started to be able to see is he's made a clearer contrast for the American people to understand how radically opposed to the idea of America, the founding ideas of America, the left is. Committedly, they are opposed to much of his agenda because it restores strength to America, restores just our whole place in the world, a place of freedom and free markets. But he's also exposed how weak the Republican establishment is in Washington, how they really don't want to stand for those principles in the way that the American people want them to. He's really, because of his I love America, I love the American people, he has really done, he's turned the light on, the rats are scurrying, whatever. He has helped America understand how far adrift the ruling class elite is from Washington, adrift from the ideas of America. You think that's too strong? Is that fair? What's your reaction?
I think you're center mass, to use the military term, dead on. I think that I would use one different word than you, though, Debbie. I would say that the Republicans that don't support him aren't weak, they're indifferent, and it's that indifference to what the MAGA people want, right? To what Trump's movement wants, to what the political movement that transcends just Donald Trump. I've always felt like he kind of walked into the movement. He didn't create it. He just spoke truths that many of us we already felt, and concerns we already shared. And the treatment of both Donald Trump and his supporters by the Republican establishment is one of the real tragedies of the past several years. And the reason I say this is because when Mitch McConnell wouldn't let him put forward so many of his nominees, when Reince Priebus was blocking bringing in the MAGA people right after the 2016 election, what they did was they assured that the institutional subversion that was done during the Obama administration has remained in place. And it's increased the danger exponentially of a Biden presidency, because all of that latent resistance, the people that have been opposed to Trump for the past 8 years, are still there.
So well said and so true. I mentioned the other day, I don't want to get off and talking about the Tea Party today, but in some interview I was doing, the Tea Party came up, and I was saying how many people criticized the Tea Party and said that it was anti-Obama, that the point of the Tea Party was anti-Obama, and the Tea Party was, and it still exists in many places, but it was opposed to the policies of President Obama, but it had steam and momentum because for the first time, the American people are watching a real leftist begin operating in Washington. And the Tea Party got formed out of frustration with the refusal of elected Republicans in the House and Senate to stand up. They finally realized these elected Republicans were more comfortable being in the ruling elite class, not ruffling feathers, not endangering their future election, not endangering future donations. That's what the Tea Party came from, that whole frustration because you can't get the ruling elite to act in accordance, on the Republican side, to act in accordance with what they say they believe in. It's the same problem now. They won't act if it in the slightest endangers their ruling elite status, their reelection, or their campaign money. It's truly astonishing to watch. But I want to turn to one other point, which I think is a huge one. You and I have trouble with this a lot too, but I want to lay out for people. I have had even Republican friends say to me, you know what, now we're in the middle of controversy in this country. We have all this litigation pending. We have many people doubting, aren't we at some point is too much to do all this challenging of the election of 2020. And, all of this is to say that the media seems to have called it, they're on the path of letting Biden announce who he's going to have in various cabinet positions. What is so bad with the Biden presidency? That was a pretty much verbatim question I got was, what's so bad if we have Biden? So beyond that you preferred Trump over Biden, I want you to, with your knowledge of what happens in Washington and what President Obama did in 8 years, seeding our country full of people who don't support the idea of America, lay out for us what's so bad about a Biden presidency.
Well, I think right off the top, going back to my comments I made just a minute ago, where you have what's the word I'm looking for? You have this overwhelming weight that's coming at us right now in terms of the institutional pressure that's already being brought. And I think when Biden comes in, he's buckling into a system that's already there. And so you won't have the normal time lag it takes for them to start implementing some of the more extreme policy recommendations. So, for example, bringing Puerto Rico into statehood, amnesty for 20 million people, packing the Supreme Court. These are all things that are sitting right there as positions that will at least be held like a sword of Damocles over the constituents, if not enacted. And I think where we're looking at Biden through the eyes of how we understood him 30, 40 years ago, we need to understand him as somebody who developed deep ties with the Chinese going back to 20 years when he took over. I think it was in 2002 when he took over the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during the Bush years. And he developed a very close relationship with the Chinese ambassador. And, as we all saw, or some of us saw who aren't just using mainstream media, we saw that they were, leveraging his position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and later as the vice president to clearly buy influence with the sitting vice president of the United States. That level of compromise where he's a de facto Chinese agent and would be brought to bear in support of their wider strategic objectives, if not on every decision, certainly on the ones that they cared about.
That's a great example. The other thing that I'm harking back to something also you said a moment ago was that when President Trump came into office, his desire to place certain people in a variety of people into positions of authority in the bureaucracy in Washington, the federal agencies, and his own White House was being blocked by McConnell saying, basically, I'm not going to help you, President Trump, get these people in, which resulted in people who haven't been placed in the bureaucracy by President Obama being remaining in place. And these are people not just who happen to have a D by their name, but they were more the left-wing Marxist ideology of Obama that were sitting in positions of authority and are still there today, undermining President Trump in a variety of ways. And all these people are sitting there just waiting for the opportunity to kick the left-wing agenda into high gear with Biden in the White House. You agree?
Yeah, look, I think it's not just the left-wing agenda. I think that's too simple. I think it has to be put into the globalist context, right? Yes, it's socialist and Marxist in its thinking, but it is globalist and corporatist at the same time. See, I think a lot of Americans are taught that free market capitalism is the opposite of socialism and communism. It's really not. I think that we have this kind of weird hybrid emerging that the Chinese appear to have perfected. That's sort of this socialist oligarchy where the corporatists get to profit and everybody else lives like a serf. And the graft and corruption is just epic. And those are the other things I think that concern me the most about Biden presidency is to legitimize what happened, which was so clearly a steal and a fraud against 74 million Americans. To do that is to basically bring about the end of rule of law in our country. And, I've studied wars all over the world, been able to participate in one or two of them. And there's one common denominator that gets a war really going, a real conflict started, that's the collapse of the rule of law. And return to the kind of state of nature. And we cannot allow that.
Yeah, very, very, very good points. So the people in this country who are very concerned about this election and watching what seems to be happening, and I don't know, this may be outside your realm, but so what should people do who just want to stand up for fair elections and want to stop the steal, as they chant at these rallies? Have any suggestions for people what they should be doing?
Off the top of my head, I think the way you beat a mobilized insurrectionist force like this is you counter-mobilize. And that doesn't mean you have to be out in the street with thousands of people. It can mean call your representative, call your congressman, call your media organization, get rid of your cable. There are a whole bunch of little things you can do and become your own little army, if you will. This is your buying power, your purchasing power. And then really, really important is just network with other people in your area, right? I mean, it's simple to say, but it's harder to do. And to begin to build out these networks and organizational frameworks that are going to help carry us through this, very fraught political time we're going through. When I look at it, I think it's really important that we don't allow ourselves to get isolated, right? I think that the media, the social media, the big tech people, a big part of their effort in marginalizing the Make America Great Again crowd, the Trump people, if you will, is that there's this overwhelming effort to kind of isolate you and marginalize you. It's very important that not be allowed to happen. At the same time, it's important that we retain message discipline. We don't push disinformation. We don't push hyperbolic rhetoric, and we avoid some of the pitfalls and traps that they're gonna try and get us to walk into.
I love that. One thing I am aware of, and I mentioned on this show before, is that I think that the people who have decision-making positions in this country impacting how this election goes, which includes electors, state legislators, state and federal court judges, and even all the way to the Supreme Court, all the judges that may have some role in this case, there will be a loud voice in the streets of America on behalf of the left, as there has been really this entire year of 2020, a loud, violent voice. And I think it's easy for many people, for elected state reps and state senators, all the way up to the Supreme Court, to think the public is kind of with the steal. The public's okay with giving Biden this election, and they don't want to be the recipient of violence and anger and targeting, as the left is so good at doing. And I would never advocate for people to engage in violence, but I do think that a very public voice on the right, letting judges, electors, state legislators, everyone who has a role, recognize there's a mass of Americans, I would say like 73 million of them, who want to see this election come out right. So, and for the idea of the Trump parades, the peaceful protests, the Stop the Steal protests that remain peaceful but are outspoken, I think those are helpful in swaying the perception these decision makers have about where America sits. You like that idea?
Yeah, I like that idea, and I think it's very important that your listeners maintain their political voice. That doesn't mean toe a party line. That means maintain your political voice. You do have one. One last kind of thought I had on that is because it sounds so doom and gloom. The founding fathers were geniuses, real ones, and the Constitution considered scenarios like this. There are mechanisms and processes in place to deal with this very scenario. And while they couldn't have foreseen big tech or the mainstream media or any of that, the Constitution is still where we need to go in a time like this. And those processes are in place. The state legislatures do have tremendous power as regards to the electors. So does Congress. So reach out to those state legislatures if you can, legislators if you can, and reach out to your congressmen. As of today, I saw the president had retweeted, or he tweeted out a thank you to Congressman Mo Brooks, who is one of the only congressmen that I know of to talk about having Congress take a look at the electors when they come. Will they accept them? It's really kind of shocking to me that one congressman is doing that. I mean, I have this vision of Congressman Mo Brooks standing there in Tiananmen Square against this line of tanks, right?
Yes.
It's kind of sad that it's come to that we don't have hundreds of GOP politicians standing up in opposition to this.
Could not agree more. Rich Higgins, I am so glad you're available today. Again, for our listeners, this is Rich's latest book, The Memo, subtitled 20 Years Inside the Deep State, Fighting for America First. Great book. Get his book. He's just a treasure in terms of his substantive knowledge about America and our national security. Thank you so very much for joining me today, Rich.
Hey, Debbie. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.